By the end of that afternoon in Tokyo, no one questioned who held authority in a room. There had been no public defeat, no raised voices, no visible struggle that could be replayed or described with technical certainty. Yet the outcome was unmistakable. Whatever question had brought the gathering together had been answered in a way that resisted explanation but not understanding. The woman who entered with a reputation sharpened by steel did not leave humiliated, did not leave diminished in stature or discipline. But the certainty she carried into the room did not accompany her out, and from that moment on the silence that followed was remembered by witnesses as the clearest evidence of what had occurred. The room itself had not been prepared for history, only for practice. Tatami mats lay flat and functional, their alignment precise but unremarkable, shaped by routine rather than ceremony. The walls carried no banners, no scrolls announcing lineage or rank. Only the quiet were left behind by years of disciplined repetition. Corners softened by contact, faint discolorations where hands had rested, scuffs near the floor that spoke not of neglect but of use. This was a space where movement mattered more than display, where refinement was measured by absence rather than addition. Those present that afternoon did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Most had spent enough time in controlled environments to understand when attention replaced conversation. They stood or sat along the edges of the room, not as spectators awaiting entertainment, but as witnesses accustomed to observing details others overlooked, posture before movement, distance before intention, the way weight settled before a step was taken. Tokyo in 1971 carried its own gravity. Tradition was not an abstract ideal here, but a living structure that governed how authority was recognized long before it was challenged. Skill was assumed to have been proven elsewhere, in years that preceded the moment, and what mattered now was whether that assumption would endure untested. Bruce Lee entered without announcement, without ceremony, without any attempt to shape the room around himself. No one called attention to him, and no one needed to. He did not claim the center of the space, nor did he avoid it. He stood where standing required no explanation, neither advancing nor retreating, his presence notable not for assertion, but for its economy. To those unfamiliar with him, there was nothing overtly confrontational in the way he carried himself. To those who understood movement, there was something harder to define, an absence of wasted intention that made the space around him feel organized rather than occupied. The atmosphere did not change all at once. It narrowed gradually, almost politely. Conversations thinned. A few people adjusted their stance without realizing they had done so. The room began to reorganize itself around a possibility that had not been spoken aloud. In such spaces, challenges were rarely declared. They formed instead through proximity, through the quiet collision of reputations that could not coexist indefinitely without clarification. When two authorities occupied the same room, the question was never whether something would happen, only how quietly it would resolve itself. No weapon was raised. No instructions were given. Yet the ordinary rhythm of practice suspended itself, as though everyone present understood that something unscheduled had begun. The air felt alert rather than tense, thinner without becoming hostile, as if the room itself had begun paying closer attention. Nothing had started in any formal sense, and yet for those who would later try to explain the moment, this was where it began. She entered with precision rather than presence. There was no flourish in her movement, no attempt to command attention through gesture or expression. Her posture accomplished that work without effort, shaped by years of formal discipline that had trained her body to move efficiently through space. The sword she carried was not ceremonial. It bore no decoration meant to impress. Its presence was practical, familiar, an extension of habit rather than an object of display. Those who recognized her understood the weight of that familiarity. Her reputation had been built slowly, reinforced through controlled demonstrations that left little room for doubt. She was known not for aggression, but for accuracy, for composure under scrutiny, for the kind of restraint that came from having answered challenges before without needing to explain herself afterward. When her attention settled on Bruce Lee, it did so without announcement. There was no overt signal, only a pause, a subtle recalibration of distance that those watching immediately recognized. The room narrowed, its focus without instruction. This was not a clash of personalities. It was a convergence of systems. Her authority represented continuity, structures refined across generations, clarity enforced through form and lineage. His presence suggested something different, not opposed to tradition, but not defined by it. A functional approach that did not rely on inherited structure to justify itself. He did not mirror her stance. He did not adopt a posture meant to signal readiness in any recognizable way. That absence unsettled expectations rooted in formality. Still, respect was present and unquestioned. No one mistook the moment for spectacle. If a challenge existed, it was mutual and unspoken. The question was not who would dominate, but whether two forms of mastery could occupy the same space without one being quietly redefined. Neither moved to begin. That restraint itself was noted. In disciplined environments, impatience often revealed weakness, and the fact that neither felt compelled to force resolution suggested a confidence deeper than assertion. The tension that followed was not sharp. It was dense, felt as pressure rather than emotion, as though the room itself was holding its breath without realizing it had done so. The challenge had been set, though no one could later say when. The room grew quieter without instruction. Breathing slowed. Small movements sounded louder than they should have been. There was no theatrical anticipation, no sense of impending violence, only awareness. No bow was exchanged. No stance clearly marked a beginning. The sword remained sheathed, its presence acknowledged without emphasis. Bruce Lee did not raise his hands into a guard, nor did he position himself at a distance, suggesting evasion or attack. He stood aligned with the space rather than opposing it. This lack of visible structure created uncertainty. Traditional demonstrations relied on clarity, clear starts, clear roles, clear conclusions. Here, none of that was offered. If rules existed, they were not being shared with the room. The sword master's awareness condensed. Those familiar with weapon work recognized the shift immediately. Distance became fluid, continuously assessed. She was no longer observing a person, but a problem that refused definition. What followed felt suspended in time, though it likely lasted only seconds. The air carried an alert stillness that witnesses later struggled to describe, as if motion itself had paused to allow something else to pass through. No one spoke. No one intervened. The room seemed to understand instinctively that interruption would be inappropriate, even disrespectful. This was not tension born of fear, but of uncertainty, of watching two forms of authority approach a boundary neither had crossed. What happened did not resemble a contest. There was no audible signal marking a beginning, no dramatic shift that could be labeled an attack. Several witnesses later admitted they missed the precise instant when everything changed, realizing only afterward that it had. The sword was never fully drawn. That absence unsettled those who understood weapons. The lack of steel in motion suggested either restraint or redundancy, and it was impossible to say which. Her hand moved, but not to strike. It adjusted, subtly and reflexively, responding to something already resolved in front of her. Bruce Lee's movement was brief and economical, not fast in the way speed is usually described, but efficient in a way that left no excess to observe. There was no flourish, no visible exertion. Those closest could not agree on the mechanics afterward. Some recalled a step that barely registered. Others described a change in angle that reorganized distance all at once. What was clear was the result. The space between them no longer mattered. The sword master paused, not from fear, but from recognition. Her body reached a conclusion before her thoughts could articulate it. No contact was necessary. In that moment, the question that had drawn the room into silence was answered through inevitability rather than dominance. Whatever option she might have chosen next, advance, retreat, draw the blade, it was already late. The structure she relied on to define control had been quietly bypassed. Bruce Lee did not hold a posture of victory. He did not wait for acknowledgement. His body returned to neutrality as though nothing significant had occurred, and that refusal to declare the moment unsettled the room more than any display could have. Authority shifted without ceremony. For several seconds, no one moved, not because they were stunned, but because perception lagged behind reality. The sword master remained composed, but altered. She had not been defeated in any conventional sense, yet something fundamental had been clarified that did not invite argument. The aftermath unfolded without announcement. No one rushed to speak. Conversations resumed cautiously, as though the space itself required a different volume. She acknowledged Bruce Lee with a slight inclination of the head. No words followed. The gesture was neither concession nor submission, but recognition of timing, of positioning, of a reality that had revealed itself without force. He responded in kind and stepped away, allowing others to absorb the moment without explanation. In environments built on instruction, explanation reinforces hierarchy. Here, explanation would have weakened the lesson. The fracture that followed was internal. Some had arrived expecting confirmation of familiar structures. What they encountered instead was exposure, not a rejection of tradition, but a demonstration that tradition alone could not account for every variable. The sword master's composure deepened, but the certainty that accompanied her into the room did not return. As people dispersed, the room returned to its ordinary state. Mats were straightened. Shoes were collected. The physical space appeared unchanged, yet those who left carried an adjustment that would surface later in training halls and conversations far removed from that afternoon. Years passed before the story traveled beyond those present, and when it did, it moved carefully. It was never told as a victory. Details blurred. Measurements disappeared. The sword often vanished from the retelling entirely. What remained was silence, the room, the absence of spectacle. The sword master continued teaching, her work subtly altered. Students noticed changes in how she spoke about distance, about awareness, about restraint, without naming their source. Bruce Lee moved on as well, leaving no public record of the encounter. Over time, the incident became less an event than a reference, cited when discussions turned toward the limits of form, the danger of certainty, the value of adaptability. Those who had been there rarely agreed on what had happened, but they agreed on what followed. A challenge without a winner, authority without explanation, and a silence that endured long after the room returned to ordinary use, long after the names involved became legend, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that something decisive had occurred without ever needing to be said.